Picture this. You're standing in a frozen courtyard outside Moscow on a January night in 1569. The wooden manor house behind you is roaring with flame, throwing orange light across snow that is no longer white. Two men in long black cassocks, Vasily Gryaznoy and Fyodor Basmanov, are dragging a boyar's wife by her hair toward a sledge while her children lie motionless near the gate. Nailed to the gatepost above them is the severed head of a hunting dog, its tongue frozen mid-snarl. Tied to Basmanov's saddle is a small silver broom that catches the firelight as he moves. They are not bandits. They are not foreign invaders. They are wearing the uniform of the Tsar's own personal army, and the man watching from horseback at the edge of the property, draped in a black monk's cassock pulled over chainmail, is Ivan Vasilievich, anointed by the Orthodox Church as Tsar of all Russia. Earlier that evening he prayed for 3 hours. Tomorrow morning he will pray again. Tonight he watches a family die in the snow because someone he cannot name whispered the word treason in a cellar 400 miles away. How does a ruler crowned with sacred oil by the Metropolitan of Moscow, a man who weeps before icons and pays monasteries to pray for the souls of strangers, build a private army of 6,000 black-robed killers and unleash them on his own country? How does an entire civilization, the bishops, the nobles, the foreign ambassadors stationed in the capital, look directly at this horror for 7 years and find reasons every morning to stay silent? Before we ride further into this frozen nightmare, if you find yourself drawn to the buried truths of history, the moments where official chronicles and human reality refuse to match, please consider hitting that like button and subscribing to the channel. And drop a comment below telling me where you are listening from tonight. I find it remarkable that we gather here from every continent, pulled together across centuries by the same stubborn curiosity about the people who came before us. To understand how thousands could vanish into the snow without consequence, you have to look at the brutal architecture of 16th century Muscovy. This was not yet the Russia of marble palaces and standing armies. It was a fragile, sprawling proto-empire stitched together by personal oaths, family vendettas, and the long memory of Mongol rule. There was no civil police force. There was no independent judiciary. There were no laws in the modern sense, only the will of the Grand Prince and the private muscle of the boyars who served him when it suited them. The boyars were the problem. These were the old aristocratic clans, families like the Shuiskys and the Belskys, whose bloodlines stretched back to the founding of Kiev. They owned vast estates worked by tied peasants. They commanded their own armed retainers, sometimes thousands strong. They held titles older than the throne in Moscow itself, and they treated the Tsar as a useful figurehead they could manipulate, marry into, or murder when convenient. Ivan was crowned Grand Prince at the age of 3, after his father Vasily died suddenly in 1533, possibly of poison. His mother Elena Glinskaya ruled as regent for 5 years. She was poisoned in 1538. Ivan was 8 years old. The boyars who took over the regency treated the child Tsar as an inconvenience. They beat his servants in front of him. They starved him in his own palace. They held council meetings where they put their muddy boots up on his father's throne, while the boy watched from a corner. He once described, years later, hiding behind a pillar while 2 boyars dragged his favorite tutor down a hallway and beat him to death on the marble floor. A child raised in that environment learns one lesson with absolute clarity. Power that cannot strike back invites destruction. The doctrine that would later justify everything, the divine right of the Tsar, the idea that the ruler answers only to God and to no man, was not abstract theology to Ivan. It was the only wall thick enough to keep the boyars from reaching him again. The air over Kazan in the summer of 1552 was thick with gunpowder, horse sweat, and the prayers of 150,000 men. For 3 centuries, since the armies of Badu Khan had burned Kiev and reduced the Russian principalities to tribute-paying vassals, no Russian ruler had defeated a Mongol successor state. Kazan was the last great Tatar Khanate on the Volga, a fortified city of stone walls and timber towers. And Ivan, 22 years old, rode at the head of the largest army Moscow had ever assembled. The siege lasted 6 weeks. Russian engineers tunneled beneath the walls and packed the chambers with barrels of black powder. When the charges detonated on October 2nd, an entire section of the fortification rose into the sky and came down as rubble and red dust. The assault that followed was savage. Russian troops poured through the breach and fought hand-to-hand through the streets of the city for an entire day. By nightfall, Kazan belonged to Moscow. The young Tsar rode through the broken gates with his banners flying. This is the version of Ivan that history forgets when it remembers only the later horror. He was, in that moment, a brilliant administrator. He reformed the law code. He convened a national council. He standardized military service. He opened diplomatic relations with England and welcomed foreign craftsmen into Moscow. He built St. Basil's Cathedral on Red Square to commemorate the victory, those impossible swirling domes that still anchor every photograph of the city. Beside him through all of this stood Anastasia Romanovna. She had been chosen from over 1,000 candidates in a bride show in 1547, a young woman from a minor noble family without political ambitions of its own. The marriage, arranged for political balance, became something rarer. Foreign envoys who watched the couple at court wrote home that the Tsar genuinely loved his wife, and that she was the only person in the empire whose voice could reach him when his rages began. She bore him 6 children. She prayed beside him. She is recorded in multiple sources as intercepting his cruelest orders before they left the palace, sending word to spare a condemned man here, to soften a punishment there. For 13 years, Russia had a Tsar and it had a saint, and the two of them held each other in balance. Then in the summer of 1560, Anastasia became suddenly, violently ill. She had been in good health. The court physicians could not name the cause. She died on August 7th. She was 30 years old. When her body was prepared for burial, observers noted her hair had fallen out in clumps and her skin had darkened in patches. Modern forensic examination of her remains in the 20th century would later detect levels of mercury in her bones consistent with poisoning. Ivan, standing over her coffin, believed it immediately. He named no specific killer. He needed none. The boyars had killed his mother. The boyars had tormented his childhood. The boyars had now taken from him the only person who had ever quieted the storm in his head. The saint was gone. What replaced her was something the boyars would spend the next 24 years trying and failing to survive. When a modern ruler suffers a psychological break, the consequences are usually contained by institutions, courts, parliaments, and independent press. When the Tsar of all Russia broke in the years after Anastasia's death, there were no such institutions. There was only him, and the 4 years that followed her funeral were a slow descent that the court watched in horror and could not stop. He drank heavily. He raged at counselors over imagined slights. He executed a handful of nobles on flimsy charges of treason, and then more and then more. His closest advisors, men who had served him through the Kazan campaign, began to flee. Prince Andrei Kurbsky, one of his most trusted generals, defected to Lithuania in 1564, and from exile wrote a series of furious letters accusing the Tsar of becoming a tyrant. Ivan wrote back. Their correspondence survives. The letters are the closest thing we have to a window into his unraveling mind, and they are a portrait of a man building a theological cage around his own paranoia, justifying every execution as the divine right of the anointed ruler to strike down his enemies. Then, in December 1564, he did something no Russian ruler had ever done. He left. He loaded sledges with his treasury, his most sacred icons, his wardrobe, and his closest loyalists, and he rode north out of Moscow in the middle of winter. He went to Alexandrov, a fortified hunting lodge about 60 miles from the capital. From there, he sent 2 letters back to Moscow. One was addressed to the boyars and the clergy, accusing them of treason, theft, and the murder of his wife. The second was addressed to the common people of Moscow, the merchants and craftsmen, telling them he held no grievance against them, and was leaving the throne because the nobility had made it impossible to rule. The effect was calculated and devastating. Moscow erupted. Crowds filled the streets demanding the boyars bring the Tsar back. A delegation of bishops and nobles traveled to Alexandrov on their knees through the snow, begging him to return. He let them wait in the cold. When he finally received them, he agreed to come back to Moscow on one condition. He would be permitted to carve out a personal state within a state. His own territory, his own treasury, his own army, his own laws. Answerable to no boyar council, no church synod, no traditional restraint. Answerable only to him. The terrified delegation agreed. They had no choice. The word he chose for this new domain came from an old Russian term for a widow's portion, the land set aside for a woman when her husband died. He called it the Oprichniki, the apartness. Into the Black Court at Alexandrov rose a man who would become Ivan's shadow and his blade. Malyuta Skuratov was not of noble birth. He could barely read. He came from a minor service family and rose through the new institution by displaying a quality the older aristocracy considered beneath them. He would do anything to anyone without hesitation if the Tsar asked. Skuratov became Ivan's chief executioner, and within 2 years his closest personal confidant. He slept near the Tsar's chambers. He attended every council meeting. He personally conducted the interrogations in the cellars beneath Alexandrov. Foreign envoys who tried to identify the real power structure of the new regime kept returning to the same name in their dispatches home. Whatever the Tsar wanted broken, Skuratov broke it. The bargain Skuratov whispered into Ivan's ear was not signed in blood or sealed with an oath. It was simpler than that. It was a doctrine, repeated until it became the air the court breathed. Mercy was weakness. The boyars had killed Anastasia. The boyars would kill Ivan next if he gave them the chance. Only systematic, visible, theatrical terror against the old aristocracy could secure the throne and avenge what had been taken. The Tsar's grief, transformed into policy, became a permanent state of war against his own nobility. Ivan, broken and willing, accepted. There was no demon in this story. There was no alchemist promising gold from lead. There was only a wounded ruler and a low-born executioner who had figured out exactly what the wound needed to keep bleeding. Alexandrovskaya Sloboda became the engine of the new machine. From the outside it looked like a monastery. Ivan wore a black cassock. He composed his own liturgical music. He led services himself, prostrating until his forehead bled. The Oprichniki who lived there with him were organized into a mock religious brotherhood with the Tsar as their abbot. They rose for matins. They sang the offices. They confessed their sins. Then they rode out and committed new ones. The uniform was deliberate and unforgettable. Long black cassocks over chainmail like warrior monks. Black horses bred and selected for the purpose. And tied to every saddle, 2 emblems that became the visual signature of the era. A severed dog's head, real, replaced when it rotted, hanging from a leather cord, and a small broom, often bound with silver wire. The official explanation, repeated to foreign visitors who asked, was that the dog's head was to sniff out treason, and the broom was to sweep it away. There were 6,000 of them at the peak. Handpicked by Ivan personally, often from minor families with no boyar connections, men whose entire status came from their black uniform and the absolute license it granted them. They were paid from Ivan's personal treasury. They answered to no civilian authority. They could enter any estate, arrest any person, seize any property, with no warrant but their own presence. The methodology was industrial. Names were collected in Alexandrov, sometimes from genuine intelligence, more often from denunciations sent in by men hopping to inherit a neighbor's land. The lists went to Skuratov. Skuratov assigned riding parties. The parties left at night and arrived at the targeted estate before dawn, surrounding the house, breaking the doors, dragging the family into the courtyard. The accused was sometimes killed on the spot. sometimes loaded onto a sledge for transport back to Alexandrov, where the cellars had been fitted with iron hooks and braziers and tools whose specific designs were not written down, because the men who used them were illiterate, and the men who watched were the Tsar. Public executions in Red Square became weekly performances. Hundreds were killed in a single afternoon. The bodies were left in the streets for days as instruction. Disposal, when it happened, used the rivers. The Moscow River and later the Volkhov carried so many corpses that ice on the surface formed unevenly around them in winter. Conservative chronicles, written carefully by men who had to live afterward, record several thousand dead across the 7 years of the Oprichniki. The real number, when the Novgorod massacre and the provincial purges and the famine that followed the disruption of agriculture are all counted, climbs into the tens of thousands. Some modern historians, working from regional records and church death registries, place the total above 30,000. Others go higher. Try to understand what this meant inside the affected society. An entire generation of the Russian provincial nobility was simply erased. Family lines that had endured since the 11th century ended in a single dawn raid. Estates that had been worked for 200 years passed in an afternoon to whatever Oprichniki had ridden through the gate that morning. Why did no one speak? Because speaking was death and silence was rewarded. Denunciation against a neighbor brought a share of his land. Refusing to denounce, or worse, defending the accused, brought your own name onto the next list. The system fed itself. Every survivor became complicit, every land transfer recorded a corpse, and the social fabric of an entire country was rewoven into something that watched its own neighbors disappear and learned to look at the snow instead. Even the church fell. Metropolitan Philip of Moscow, the highest religious authority in Russia, made the calculation that someone had to stand up. In 1568, during a service at the Dormition Cathedral, with Ivan present in his black cassock surrounded by his black-robed riders, Philip refused to give the Tsar his blessing. He spoke from the pulpit, in front of the congregation, and named the killings. He called Ivan to repentance. He was dragged from the cathedral, stripped of his office, and imprisoned in a monastery in Tver. A year later, when Ivan was riding north toward Novgorod, Skuratov was dispatched to the monastery to ask the deposed metropolitan for a blessing on the campaign. Philip refused again. Skuratov strangled him with a pillow and reported back that the holy man had died of overheating in his cell. Into this machine rode a foreigner whose presence would prove unexpectedly important for the historical record. Heinrich von Stadten was a German mercenary from Westphalia who arrived in Moscow in 1564, drifted between minor positions, and in 1567 was admitted into the Oprichniki. He served for several years. He participated in raids. He grew rich looting the estates of his victims. And unlike his Russian colleagues, he was literate, observant, and meticulous. When he eventually escaped back to Germany, he wrote a detailed memoir of everything he had seen and done. The manuscript is one of the most important surviving sources for the Oprichniki, precisely because von Stadten had no reason to soften what he described. He was proud of it. He wrote with the casual self-congratulation of a man who had figured out a system and profited from it. Ivan himself, through all of this, oscillated between extremes that contemporaries could not understand and that modern historians still argue about. He led the Oprichniki in raids personally. He participated in the interrogations. He invented punishments, including sewing condemned men into bearskins and releasing trained dogs into the courtyard. He drove iron-tipped staffs through the feet of prisoners pinned to the floor of his audience chamber. Then he would retreat to his chapel and weep before the icons for hours, prostrating until guards had to lift him. He kept lists of his victims by name and sent the lists to monasteries with payment for prayers. He believed in hell with absolute literal conviction. He believed he was going there. He continued. By the autumn of 1569, the machine was running at its full capacity. And Ivan began to hear what would prove to be the rumor that broke everything. Reports reached Alexandrov, possibly fabricated by Skuratov himself, that the city of Novgorod, the great medieval trading republic in the north, was conspiring to defect to Poland-Lithuania. The accusation was false. Modern historians who have examined the surviving evidence find no credible basis for it. Novgorod had been integrated into Muscovy for nearly a century. Its archbishop was loyal. Its merchants traded across the Baltic but showed no interest in foreign rule. The charge was paranoia given a target. Ivan believed it instantly. In December 1569, he assembled 1,500 Oprichniki and rode north in person. The campaign that followed was not a punishment expedition. It was the deliberate destruction of a Russian city by its own czar. The army reached Novgorod in January 1570 and sealed off every exit. The massacre lasted 5 weeks. Families were arrested by the hundreds, tied to wooden sledges, and driven onto the frozen surface of the Volkhov River where soldiers had cut holes in the ice. The sledges were pushed in. Soldiers stood on the banks with hooked poles, pushing under any head or hand that emerged. Witnesses who survived, because they had been outside the city when the gates closed, reported the river ran with bodies for weeks. The monasteries were looted. The Cathedral of St. Sophia was stripped of its ornaments. Priests were tied to horses and dragged through the streets until they came apart. Merchants were boiled alive in their own warehouses. Children were burned in their homes when the soldiers fired the wooden districts. The most reliable contemporary estimates, drawn from a third Pissar's chronicle and cross-referenced with the surviving tax registers, showing how many households simply vanished from the rolls after 1570, place the death toll between 15 and 25,000. Other sources go higher. The chronicler who recorded 60,000 was almost certainly exaggerating, but the chronicler was writing about something he had survived, and the number reflects what it felt like to walk through Novgorod that February. The scale was so monstrous that something shifted in the court around Ivan. Even men who had ridden with him through every previous campaign began to step back from his table. Skuratov continued to serve. Basmanov continued to dance. But the foreign envoys stationed in Moscow, who had been writing carefully neutral dispatches for years, began to send home assessments that used the word madness without qualification. And the watching powers, who had been content to let Russia destroy itself, began to move. The Crimean Khan Devlet Jure, observing from the south, calculated that the Tsar's army had spent itself on its own provinces, and that Moscow itself was now defended by men trained to terrify peasants rather than fight cavalry. In the spring of 1571, he began to gather his riders. The reckoning, when it came, was not delivered in a courtroom. It was delivered in fire. In May 1571, Devlet Jure crossed the Oka River with 40,000 Crimean Tatar horsemen and rode unopposed toward Moscow. The Oprichniki, who had spent 6 years perfecting the arts of pre-dawn raids and cellar interrogations, met him in the field and broke immediately. They had never fought a real army. They had never faced an opponent who could shoot back. The Tatars reached Moscow on May 24th. The wooden districts caught fire almost at once. The fire spread through every quarter of the city in a single afternoon. Tens of thousands of Muscovites died, suffocated in cellars, drowned in the river trying to escape, crushed at the gates. The Kremlin's stone walls survived. Almost nothing else did. Ivan was not in the city. He had ridden north days earlier in disguise when the scouts brought word of the advance. The myth of the Black Knights collapsed in a single afternoon of smoke. The foreign envoys who had been afraid to write what they thought now wrote it openly. The boyars who had survived began, very quietly, to recover their courage. And the following year, when Devlet Jure returned with 60,000 riders intending to finish what he had started, the army that met him at the village of Melody and broke the Crimean horde in a 3-day battle was not the Oprichniki. It was the regular Russian army, commanded by Prince Mikhail Vorotinsky, an old boyar of exactly the kind Ivan had spent a decade trying to exterminate. The public verdict was delivered in the contrast. The black riders had burned villages. The despised regulars had saved the country. In the autumn of 1572, Ivan abolished the Oprichniki. He did not announce it as a reform. He simply stopped using the word. He returned the confiscated territories, on paper at least, to the traditional administrative structure. He forbade anyone from speaking the word Oprichniki aloud, on pain of being flogged in public. The institution that had defined 7 years of Russian history was, by official decree, erased from speech. What he did not abolish was the paranoia. He turned it with the same intensity on the men who had served him. Fyodor Basmanov, the dancing favorite who had charmed the court at Alexandrov, was arrested and accused of treason. According to multiple contemporary sources, including von Staden's memoir, Ivan ordered Basmanov to prove his loyalty by killing his own father, Alexei. Basmanov did it. He was executed shortly afterward anyway. The grotesque ritual of the demand was its own message to anyone still in the inner circle. Service was no defense. Many of the original Oprichniki were killed by the same methods they had perfected, by the colleagues they had trained beside, in the cellars they had themselves designed. The institutional knowledge passed cleanly to the next set of men in black cassocks, who would die in their turn. In his final decade, Ivan compiled the synodics. These were long memorial lists, written out by court scribes from his dictation, of the victims he could remember by name. He sent them to monasteries across Russia with payment for prayers. The lists name thousands of people. The lists are still studied. They are, in their own way, the most damning confession in Russian history, because the man dictating them was still on the throne, still anointed, still ordering executions, and still convinced that the prayers he was paying for would somehow balance the ledger before he had to face what he believed waited for him. Malyuta Skuratov, the architect of the bargain, did not live to see the final purges. He was killed in 1573 during a siege in the Livonian War, struck by a cannonball while leading an assault. Ivan, when the news reached him, wept publicly and ordered the chief executioner buried with full military honors. The man who had strangled the Metropolitan of Moscow with a pillow received a state funeral, and his family received a generous pension, and his daughter eventually married the future Tsar Boris Godunov, which means that the blood of Malyuta Skuratov runs through every Russian noble house descended from that line for the next 3 centuries. Heinrich von Staden, the German mercenary who had ridden with the Black Riders and grown rich on their plunder, slipped out of Russia before the purges reached him. He returned to the Holy Roman Empire with his looted fortune, presented his memoir to Emperor Rudolph II as a proposal for the German conquest of Muscovy, and lived comfortably until his death sometime around 1579. His manuscript sat in archives for 300 years before being rediscovered and published in the 20th century. The man who had written the most detailed surviving account of the Oprichniki's atrocities never faced consequence for any of them. He died in bed, in his own country, with his profit intact. The architects of the worst bargain walked away. The accomplices who could not walk away died, and the man who had wanted the bargain in the first place sat on his throne until 1584, weeping over lists and ordering new ones. Within a single generation, the story began to warp. Ivan was the first Russian ruler to formally call himself Tsar, an imperial title borrowed from Rome, and the rulers who came after him needed his memory to be useful. The Romanovs, who took the throne in 1613, had a particular interest. Anastasia, the wife whose death had broken him, had been a Romanov. Their entire dynastic claim rested partly on her marriage. They could not allow her husband to be remembered as a monster, so they remembered him as a tragic, complicated state builder who had been forced into harshness by treasonous nobles. By the 19th century, court historians had refined the rehabilitation. The Oprichniki was reframed as a necessary tool against an obsolete aristocracy, a brutal but progressive step in the modernization of the Russian state. The victims were not mentioned. The Volkhov River was not mentioned. Metropolitan Philip was vaguely acknowledged as a saint, but the circumstances of his death were rendered in passive voice. Then Stalin took an interest. The parallels were not subtle. A ruler who saw enemies everywhere, who built a personal security apparatus answerable only to himself, who purged his own elites in waves, who needed a historical precedent that justified what he was doing. Ivan was perfect. In 1941, Stalin personally commissioned the filmmaker Sergei Eisenstein to make Ivan the Terrible as a two-part epic. The first film, released in 1944, portrayed Ivan as a visionary, and the Oprichniki as romantic, doomed warrior monks defending the motherland from treasonous boyars. Stalin loved it. Eisenstein won the Stalin Prize. The second film took a darker view, ending with Ivan haunted by his own crimes. Stalin hated it. The film was banned. Eisenstein was summoned to the Kremlin, told personally that his portrayal of the Oprichniki was unacceptably negative, and instructed to revise. He never finished the revision. He died of a heart attack the following year. The second film was not released until 1958, after Stalin himself was dead. The drowned children of Novgorod did not appear in any film. The peasant families burned in their estates did not receive a monument. The boyar daughters dragged into the snow at dawn were not named in any chronicle that the Soviet state permitted to be reprinted. Society sanitized the horror because looking at it honestly would have meant looking at the present. We tell ourselves comfortably that this kind of machinery belongs to the deep past, that the modern world's institutions, its courts and its press and its checks and its balances, would never permit a single paranoid man to build a private army of 6,000 killers and turn them loose on his own population for 7 years. The Oprichniki did not die in 1572. The institution was abolished, the word was forbidden, the writers were killed or retired, but the pattern survived them, and it has been rebuilt under different names in different countries with monotonous regularity ever since. Every regime that has answered an autocrat's paranoia by building a personal security apparatus outside the regular state, every secret police force given license to terrorize its own population in the name of loyalty, every system that rewards denunciation and punishes silence, every leader who has decided that mercy is weakness, and that the only safe nobility is a dead one, has been a direct descendant of the men in black cassocks. The uniforms change. The function does not. As we close this chapter, the temptation is to dwell on Ivan, on the spectacle of his rages and the theater of his grief, on the strange black brotherhood at Alexandrov. The temptation is to make the monster the point. The legacy of this story does not belong to him. It does not belong to Malyuta Skuratov, buried with honors. It does not belong to Heinrich von Staden, dying rich in his own bed in Westphalia. It belongs to the families tied to sledges on the Volkhov in February of 1570, who went under the ice without their names being written down. It belongs to the monks of Tver and the priests dragged behind horses through the streets of Novgorod. It belongs to the boyar wife at the gate of that estate outside Moscow on the night this story began, and to her children lying in the snow while a silver broom caught the firelight on a saddle. It belongs to every person whose only memorial is a single line in a list, a guilty czar dictated in his final years, and sent to a monastery with payment for prayers he did not believe would be enough. Their silence in the snow paid for a czar's nightmares, and history, for 400 years, has rewarded the men who held the knives. Thank you for riding through this difficult history with me tonight. If this story changed how you think about absolute power and the men who wield it, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you do not miss the next one. I highly recommend my previous video on the terrifying realities of medieval plague doctors, which sits in the card at the top of the screen right now. And drop a comment below telling me which forgotten chapter of history you want us to uncover next. I read every one of them. I will see you in the next chapter.